for people who are unfamiliar with you, please tell us your name, what your background is, and really what you've been doing for the last several years.
So my name is Maryn McKenna. I am a journalist, and my specialty as a journalist is what I think of as public health and global health and food policy. And my big project for the last couple of years has been an investigation into how we use antibiotics in raising the meat that we eat every day, how we got into that situation, which is a terrible misuse of antibiotics, and how we're going to find our way back out again. And that investigation culminated in a book called Big Chicken, which was released in 2017 and is coming out in paperback this year.
What is your book about, Big Chicken, the incredible story of how antibiotics created modern agriculture and changed the way the world eats?
So a lot of people don't know this, but most meat animals raised on the planet get doses of antibiotics on most of the days of their lives. And they don't get those antibiotics because the animals are sick. If they were sick, it would be perfectly okay to use antibiotics on them. That's the way we use antibiotics in human beings. Instead, meat animals get antibiotics either to make them grow faster, because the drugs have an effect on what we'd call their gut microbiome, or they get them to protect them against diseases of crowding in barns and feedlots. This seems like a good thing because it allows us to raise meat animals more quickly and less expensively. But the problem is that it also creates antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And antibiotic resistance is considered by the World Health Organization and the major national health agencies around the world as one of the most profound threats to human health in this century. And so without knowing it, for decades now, since the 1950s, we have been courting this profound human health threat in the service of making our meat cheaper and easier to produce.
Do you eat chicken? And what are the health consequences of eating it these days?
I actually am a meat eater myself. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this investigation and write this book is I felt that as someone who eats meat, I am entitled to ask questions about how the meat I eat is produced, what kind of lives the animals have, what kind of environmental impact farming has, and also what unsuspected health threats, such as antibiotic resistance, exist because of the meat that I might be eating. And I came out of this investigation and out of writing this book still eating meat. In fact, the first and last scenes of the book are scenes of me stuffing my face with delicious farm-raised chicken from a couple of different places. But I came out of it with a completely different understanding about the unsuspected, unseen costs of meat production. As a result, for the most part now, when I can, I buy meat from smaller producers because I think they need my support more. And I'm absolutely committed to buying meat that is raised without routine antibiotic use. As it happens, that's getting easier all the time, even from really big producers, because consumers have spoken and have told meat production that they want antibiotics out of that process, and the industry is responding.
If people have been eating chicken for a long time, and many people are in their 80s and 90s, doesn't that mean chicken is okay to eat?
So this is a complex process, so let me unpack it a little. The way that we give antibiotics to animals is that we feed them tiny doses that are far too small to cure an infection. Those antibiotics that are consumed go into their guts, and there's a community of bacteria that lives in the guts of us and every warm-blooded thing. Those antibiotics affect the bacteria in such a way that they either cause them to be resistant or turn the whole population of bacteria more toward resistance. Then those resistant bacteria leave the animal in a couple of different ways. One is, we're talking about gut contents. So when the animals poop, when they produce manure on a farm, that manure is loaded with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And it can leave the farm in storm runoff, through groundwater, dust on the wind, on the feet of insects and rodents, and then the resistance DNA contained in those bacteria enters the environment and passes into other bacteria. The other way that those bacteria can leave the farm is on the meat of the animals as they're slaughtered and get turned into meat, get packaged up in styrofoam and sent to stores. If you happen to have a piece of meat that contains those antibiotic-resistant bacteria on its surface, and you don't cook it with the precision of a microbiology lab, you are likely to get an antibiotic-resistant foodborne illness like E. coli or salmonella or something like that. Those illnesses make hundreds of thousands of people sick in the United States every year. If you're a meat eater and you haven't had that kind of illness, you're very fortunate. But you're at risk, even if you don't eat meat, because of that other transport of resistant bacteria away from farms into the environment, carrying that resistance DNA that then propagates into other bacteria. So it's possible that someone could unknowingly be at risk from an infection that originated on a farm, even if they never went near that farm or never even ate meat at all.
What's different about a 1919 and a 2019 chicken?
If you were to see those two chickens side by side, if we could today have a chicken that was the standard barnyard chicken of 1919 versus the standard industrial chicken of today, you would probably think that they were not related. Chickens today grow to twice the weight in half the time that they did before World War II. In fact, back in, let's say, in 1919, in the time of, I don't know, our grandparents or our great-grandparents, chickens were really the province of individual farms, often actually of farm wives, that they had a couple of chickens running around in the back of the farm. They were there mostly for producing eggs, and the women sold them at farmers markets or sold them into general stores. That's where we get that phrase, women having butter and egg money. It's because farmers' wives had butter and egg as their particular province. And they only ate chicken as a meat when those hens were done laying eggs, or when they had a couple of extra roosters that had hatched out and they didn't really need them. Then we get to World War II, and that meat production that is episodic and small scale and confined to individual small farms becomes industrialized on a vast scale to feed the troops that are in the millions deploying around the world. In the midst of World War II, we get a thing that changes the world forever, and that is the discovery of antibiotics. We think that antibiotics have always been here, but really they only arise in the late 1940s. So the antibiotic era is less than 100 years old. Antibiotics get introduced to meat production, and they trigger this cascading series of changes in meat animals that you can actually see most clearly in chicken, in which animals grow more quickly, they are bred to put on weight more rapidly, they're bred to be more docile and more amenable to being crowded together in farms. And so in the case of a chicken, that chicken from 1919 would have been skinny and upright and weighed only about 2 pounds and probably had colored feathers and could flap up into a tree and avoid predators. And the chicken of 2019 is a 5 or 6 pound, docile, white-feathered, slow-moving block of protein that doesn't do much but sit on the floor of its barn and get up and eat and drink and sit back down again.
When were antibiotics invented and put into regular use, and what was different about health, medicine, and disease prevention before and after the introduction of antibiotics?
So I think most of us think of antibiotics as a thing that has always been around, because they've been around throughout our lifetimes. But in fact, they haven't been around that long. The first recognition of the first antibiotic is in 1928, when Alexander Fleming, the father of penicillin, as the story goes, leaves a window open in his laboratory in London, probably because it was August in 1928 and they didn't have air conditioning. And 2 weeks later, he comes back from taking his annual vacation. He looks at petri dishes of bacteria that he's been growing and notices that something is killing the bacteria that he had streaked onto the plates. And he figures out that what is killing them is something secreted by a mold that had blown in that window. That mold is penicillium mold. And from it we get the first natural antibiotic, penicillin. But we don't get penicillin until about 1943 because it's a very hard drug to develop and grow at scale. And it's really the influence of the war and so many soldiers and sailors being so gravely injured that really pushes industrialization of penicillin. So what does all this mean? Before the advent of antibiotics, any injury could kill you. It would start an infection for which we had effectively no treatment except maybe ice baths and aspirin and cold compresses, and if you got injured in some remote part of your body, maybe amputation. This is not a theoretical thing for me. One of my great uncles was a fireman in New York City. He was injured at the firehouse on one of his days off. Just something fell off the shelf and bumped and scratched him. And a month later, he died of what they called blood poisoning, and we now call septic shock. And that was 5 years before the first human trial of penicillin. So antibiotics were this astonishing gift to the world that suddenly made that unbelievable threat of infection from even minor injuries just go away. But as with all great discoveries, they had a downside too.
Why did you write a book called Big Chicken, and what was the main point of the book?
So I have been, as I said, I'm a journalist. I work on public health. And I've been fascinated for a long time, for more than a decade now, by the problem of antibiotic resistance and what we do about it. And what antibiotic resistance means, pretty simply, is that antibiotics no longer work. And therefore, all of those infections that we were subject to at the beginning of the 20th century are now turning around to menace us again in the 21st because effectively we wasted antibiotics. Now, we wasted antibiotics in a number of ways, and medicine really takes the blame for this first, that we give antibiotics for the wrong things, we give them for the wrong amount of time, people don't take them the way they should, and as a result, since probably the 1960s, that's only about 20 years in which antibiotics worked without question, we've been losing the power of antibiotics and having to invent newer and newer generations of them. So I got interested in this, and I decided to look at one particular infection, which is called MRSA, or MRSA, drug-resistant staph. And I ended up writing a book that was essentially the biography of MRSA as a way of telling the story of how antibiotic resistance had emerged around the world. And in the midst of reporting that book, which is a story about how medicine did antibiotics wrong, I stumbled across a statistic that completely knocked me back on my heels, which was that in the United States, in a particular year, this year was actually 2011, so not very long ago, we sold in the US 4 times as many antibiotics by weight for use in animals as we did for use in human beings. And this just made no sense to me, because how could livestock be that sick that they would need that much antibiotic? And it turned out that livestock aren't sick, that since almost the beginning of the antibiotic era, we've been using antibiotics not to cure animals primarily, but to make them more efficient machines for the production of meat. Now, I had just exited from a couple of years in which I had spoken to researchers and doctors and victims of drug-resistant infections and the parents of children who were killed by drug-resistant staph. And all of these people were saying to me, antibiotics are precious, antibiotics are rare, and we need to protect them and conserve their power, and we are wasting them. And now suddenly here were these statistics that were showing me that in agriculture, we were wasting antibiotics even more than we had in medicine. And so as a journalist, I just had to find out more about that. And so that led to this 4 years that led to this book, Big Chicken. And the reason the book is called Big Chicken is that it turns out that chickens are really important to the story of antibiotics in agriculture. Chickens are the animals that get antibiotics first, experimentally, in 1948, that prove that what's called growth promotion as a means of giving antibiotics is going to work. And in the United States, just now, in 2018, 2019, chicken as a sector of the protein economy is turning away from routine antibiotic use. It's way ahead of cattle production, it's way ahead of pig production in not using antibiotics anymore. So to me, the chicken brackets that story of how we made this historic mistake and how we're starting to find our way back out of it again.
You said that 4 times as many antibiotics are used to feed animals than given to humans. Explain why this is a problem.
So I want to be clear that this statistic of 4 times as much antibiotic sold for use in animals as for use in humans in the United States is a couple of years out of date now. Those numbers actually date from 2011, which was a year when it was particularly easy to match up the 2 different databases. The situation in humans hasn't changed much. The numbers for animals are actually trending down a little bit, and that's really encouraging, and we can talk about why that is. All of this dates back to the beginning of the antibiotic era, to 1948, when a kind of rogue biologist who's working for one of the early antibiotic manufacturers wants to find an extra use for his company's drug. And he feeds manufacturing waste leftovers from making antibiotics to chickens. And the chickens get fat faster than they should have. So the way this becomes institutionalized is that tiny doses of antibiotic, way too small to cure an infection, are added mostly to the feed of animals, just ground up in a couple of grams per ton, and added to the feed of cattle and hogs and chickens. In the 1940s and 50s, they just perceived that this worked, and they didn't do a very good job of interrogating why it was that it worked. We're pretty sure now that what happens is that the antibiotics, when they're consumed, affect the mix of bacteria that lives in our guts, the guts of every living thing, called the gut microbiome, in such a way that it allows animals to extract more nutrition from their feed more efficiently than they would have otherwise. So they put on tasty muscle more quickly than under the otherwise normal feeding regime they would have. So that's the benefit in the cost-benefit equation of feeding antibiotics to animals. The cost is that it inevitably generates antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And it's inevitable because antibiotic resistance is an inevitable biological process. Any time you expose a bacterium to something that is coming at that bacterium to kill it, the bacterium is going to want to defend itself. And the defenses that they put up, the mutations that they create or adopt to defend themselves against chemical compounds, that's antibiotic resistance, the thing that makes antibiotics not work anymore. So antibiotic resistance develops in the gut of animals when they're fed antibiotics, and then washes into the environment or travels on their meat, but creates more antibiotic resistance in bacteria, disease bacteria, than otherwise would have existed in the world.
How did chickens change and grow so much over the last 100 years?
The process of changing chicken from those skinny little chickens of the beginning of the 20th century to the big, blocky, docile, muscle-heavy chickens that we have today in industrial agriculture, that's a process that starts with feeding them antibiotics, but it doesn't stop there. In addition, there has been, over the decades, precision crossbreeding, just old-fashioned crossbreeding, nothing transgenic or GMO, that creates animals that have higher appetites, higher metabolisms, less desire to exercise, and so they both are producing meat more quickly and they're not using energy so much. People in the poultry industry call it feed efficiency. How much feed do you feed to an animal in order to create a pound of flesh? Chicken's feed efficiency is really, really good. And that didn't happen naturally. It happened because of crossbreeding. So antibiotics, then crossbreeding, and then precision nutrition as well. There's an enormous industry of making feed for livestock. And that feed, which is different for every species, is really tuned up to get them the maximum, to produce in them the maximum amount of muscle production as fast as possible. So it's kind of a sort of a rolling, snowballing process of antibiotics first, and then crossbreeding, hybridization, and then precision nutrition. And all of those end up in that chicken that we have today that in large-scale poultry production is so very different from the chickens of 100 years ago.
Why do we give antibiotics to most healthy animals on the planet on most days of their lives?
So I think it's important to say that there are legitimate uses for antibiotics in livestock, and that is when livestock are sick, when they actually are brewing or have developed an infection. It is a completely legitimate thing to give antibiotics to make animals better. To not do that would be a violation of animal welfare. I am definitely not saying that we should never use antibiotics, but we shouldn't use antibiotics for the things that they were not designed for. When we give antibiotics to human beings, we say, you need a test, you need a prescription, and you need to take that prescription until it's done, to avoid resistant bacteria arising in your system. We ought to behave the same way with antibiotics in livestock. And the good news is that we are starting to do that in the United States, that a combination of changes in regulation and especially changes in consumer awareness are really leading industries to use antibiotics only in the most appropriate ways.
How did chickens go from a small bird to the main source of meat in the United States? 91 pounds for every man, woman, and child. And chicken is growing fastest in consumption around the world since they're easier to raise than other animal products.
So there's a really interesting scientific paper that was published at the beginning of this year by some scientists in England. They dubbed the broiler chicken, the chicken that we all eat every day, the bird of the Anthropocene. What they meant by that is that in this era, where the world is now marked by what man has done to it, there is no better mascot than the chicken, because there is no other bird, no other source of protein that we produce at such scale, that we take so little care of, and that we have changed so much. They predicted that when our civilization is dug up thousands and thousands and thousands of years from now, our marker will be not the remains of our technology or the remains of our architecture, but a layer of chicken bones. So how did we get to that situation? Well, we talked about how there was this desire to produce more protein in World War II. There was a desire after World War II to cut costs. Chicken was perfectly adapted to that. Chickens don't live very long, so you can crossbreed them pretty quickly. They don't need a lot of land, so you can produce a lot of them in a small area. And they're moderately tasty, and they were hybridized to be more tasty. But another thing that happens with chicken, and there's a very specific historical moment when it happens, is that in 1977, the federal government issued the first ever dietary guidelines for Americans, which is a thing that now has come out of the government every couple of years ever since. In those guidelines, they said for the first time ever, Americans should eat less saturated fat. Now, they didn't actually say, but people heard them saying, Americans should eat less red meat. And since people thought they were being told not to eat red meat, they turned instead to white meat, to chicken. And if you draw a graph of the consumption of beef and chicken in the United States over the decades, 1977, that year of the first dietary guidelines, is the year when beef starts to go down, because Americans are always a beef-eating people, and chicken starts to rise. And we now eat twice as much chicken as we do beef every year. Back in the 1970s, that ratio was reversed.
So because the government puts out these guidelines, you're saying that's why Americans are eating more chicken?
So that kind of was the first impetus, but another really interesting thing happens, which I think everyone will recognize, which is that the chicken industry realizes that with this government recommendation, there is a huge market opportunity for them. So 1977, the first dietary guidelines. 1980, the first chicken McNugget. What McDonald's did with the chicken nugget was take chicken off the bone and make it a thing that was available to everyone in an uncomplicated way. And there's actually fairly good evidence that McDonald's is not solely responsible for this idea, that the prototype of the nugget was actually invented by a crazy scientist at Cornell University in 1963, who was also looking for ways to increase chicken sales by making it possible for housewives not always to have to deal with a bony thing that they had to slice apart and roast or fry or something. He came up with chicken sticks that were kind of like fish sticks. And then McDonald's took the idea and ran with it. And in 1980, they produced a thing that was chicken that we could eat walking down the street, driving our cars, put them on the kids' tray on on the dinner table and know they weren't going to make a mess and fling the bones all around. So they made chicken. We already knew that chicken was smart to eat. They made it easy to eat. And that really is the moment where chicken consumption in America completely rolls off the charts.
How did chickens 100 years ago go from being muscular, not delicious, and with a very rich flavor to today's chickens that are tender and soft?
So an interesting thing happens to chickens. We talked about how chickens back in our grandparents' or great-grandparents' time were these scrawny little things running around and flapping around a barnyard, and now they're very docile blocks of protein that sit in a barn. A chicken that runs around a barnyard, chasing its chicks, flapping up into trees to avoid the farm dog, scratching in the dirt, eating bugs and so forth, that has a rich and varied diet, and so it's going to have a rich and varied flavor. But it's also probably going to be pretty tough. Even if you take a young chicken, not a hen that's been running around for a couple of years, any bird that's getting exercise, that is using its muscles, its muscles are going to be more like a rubber band. And its muscles are also going to be more dark colored, like the dark meat is really going to be dark because it's been perfused with blood from all that exercise. Chickens like that didn't have very much meat on a carcass, and because they were chewy, they mostly had to be cooked in the sort of like slow, wet heat that our grandparents and great-grandparents used, like stew and fricassee and smothered chicken and things like that. So antibiotics makes it possible to produce more chicken. But then the chicken industry has to convince people to eat more chicken. And the way they do that is to make the chicken easier to eat, to make it not dark and not chewy and not strongly flavored. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, there's a nationwide contest to breed a better chicken, a chicken that consumers will find more palatable. They call it the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. And I always feel like there ought to be some sort of like science fiction-y kind of sound effect behind my voice when I say that. The USDA challenges chicken breeders across the country to come up with a chicken that is going to be less like a barnyard chicken. It has to put on weight easily. It has to be kind of soft and delicious. It has to be white feathered, because supermarkets already know that when you pull the feathers out of a chicken and the feathers are dark, they leave a sort of like cast in the skin that consumers don't find very palatable. And so this nationwide contest, rolling from state to state to state, produces by 1951 the chicken that we know today. And in making chicken, more docile, more white feathered, with more flesh on the bone per bird, they took the chicken out of the setting in which it had the conditions that made it tasty. And if you go, as I did for research to my book, to countries where chickens are still raised in that old manner, or even pastured farms here in the United States, which are returning to old production practices, their chickens, when you cook them, look like what the chickens of the 1900s must have looked like. They're skinny, they have less flesh relative to their bones, their flesh is bouncier, and it's incredibly delicious. When we say something tastes like chicken, most of the time what we're really saying is that it doesn't taste like very much. It just kind of tastes like bland protein. But a chicken that's a barnyard chicken, whether it's an old variety of chicken or one produced by these new farmers, that's really taste like chicken.
With chickens being bred so differently compared to 100 years ago, what's the cost to the chickens?
There actually are a lot. So one thing that I think people don't know is that the average industrial chicken today lives only 42 days. And yet they are the size that a full-grown chicken of a couple of years would have been 100 years ago. They get that size so quickly because of the use of antibiotics and crossbreeding and precision nutrition, all the things we've talked about. The cost to the chicken is that their bodies are growing at just about the absolute limit that their genetics will allow. So there are a lot of accounts in the scientific literature about how chickens grow so fast that they are in pain, that their muscles grow bigger and faster than their bones can accommodate. And so they don't actually want to flap very much. They don't want to walk around very much. If they don't walk around very much, if their barns are not very well maintained, they may get sort of diseases or infections that are caused by the barn conditions, like foot infections are essentially sort of knee infections, though their knees go backward from ours. And so to grow chickens that rapidly is, even though it's great for keeping down the cost of the meat we eat, it really is a profound animal welfare concern.
You've said that 23,000 people die each year from antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Is the rate rising, and why is this happening?
The Secretary General of the United Nations has called antibiotic resistance the greatest and most urgent global risk. The Chief Medical Officer of the United Kingdom compared it to as serious a threat to society as terrorism. The former head of the Centers for Disease Control in the United States gives antibiotic resistance names like nightmare bacteria. And yet it's a threat that most of us are not actually aware of most of the time. But in fact, just in the United States, and this is probably an underestimate, 23,000 people a year die of drug-resistant infections, and another 2 million a year are sick enough to go to a doctor or be admitted to the hospital. Worldwide, the estimate is 750,000 deaths a year. And the prediction is that if we can't get resistance under control, the death rate by the year 2050, which is not very far away, is going to be 10 million deaths a year and a loss to the planet of $100 trillion in productivity. Now, agriculture is not solely responsible for this. There's misuse of antibiotics in medicine. There's misuse of antibiotics in other types of agriculture, such as fruit agriculture. Apples and pears, and lately oranges get sprayed with apples and pears and oranges lately get sprayed with antibiotics as well. But the reality is that simply in terms of the volumes, animal agriculture accounts for an enormous amount of the antibiotics that we misuse around the globe, and therefore it is pumping up the problem of antibiotic resistance and sending that trend in the wrong direction when we should be doing everything we could to reduce drug-resistant infections. The continued misuse of antibiotics makes the problem worse and worse.
May not be the rosiest picture for some folks watching this video. Do you have any optimism about where this is all going?
So, as a reporter, I have covered a lot of stories that really have unhappy endings. And it was kind of a pleasant surprise to discover that there actually is some cause for hope in this long story of this long mistake of misusing antibiotics in agriculture. The United States tried to change its policies around animal agriculture and antibiotics in 1977 and was not successful because of political interference from Congress. Then the Obama administration came in 40 years later and decided that they were going to try again, and they actually succeeded. So in one of its last acts in office, literally in the last couple of days of the Obama administration, a change was created in regulations at the Food and Drug Administration that made one of the two subtherapeutic or non-curative uses of antibiotics in animals essentially illegal in the United States. Antibiotics can be used to cure animals, to protect them against diseases or to make them put on weight more quickly. That putting on weight more quickly, which is called growth promotion, has been no longer legal in the US since January 2017. And as a result, you can actually see in the federal data that the consumption of antibiotics by livestock is sliding down for the first time in decades. Now, there's a lot of work still to be done because this has been happening first in chicken, because the chicken industry was pushed by consumers to give up antibiotics, and also because chickens in some way, because they don't live very long and they don't take up much space, they're kind of uncomplicated to change. Cattle and pigs are more challenging, they'll take longer. But this brings the United States more in line with what Europe has been doing for many years. And so that's good news, because fewer antibiotics pumped into the ecosystem means less antibiotic resistance occurring. However, we still have a long way to go, because preventive use of antibiotics, which is a misuse as well, is still fully legal, not just in the United States, but in almost every country on the planet. And also, there are other countries where meat consumption and production is rising, mostly in the emerging economies of the developing world, in India and China and Brazil. Those emerging middle classes really want to eat meat. We have to show them how to produce the meat they're going to produce without misusing antibiotics the way we did in the past. If we can do that, and they can follow our lead, we really might significantly impact this problem for the first time. If not, in a couple of years, we'll be back where we started, and resistant infections will be as much of a danger as they ever were.